Today's presentation will include some discussions around analytes, column materials and chemistry, and practical method considerations when looking at aggregate analysis using size exclusion. Aggregate analysis is a critical and necessary component for proper characterization of biotherapeutics. While there are several different approaches to examining aggregates and fragments, size exclusion chromatography is likely the most utilized. This is in part due to its relative simplicity, reproducibility, and ease of transferability. When addressing the requirements for developing an effective size exclusion method, it's important to consider how does system configuration impact LC separation and data quality, column dimensions and surface chemistries. Importantly, what method parameters you need to consider for development of a robust method when transferability is anticipated. In today's discussion, we'll cover all practical considerations for ensuring method sustainability. However, we'll begin with a brief reminder about the fundamentals of size exclusion chromatography. Although developing a robust SEC method should be straightforward, it hardly ever is. In theory, you should be able to select a column, run a sample, pass system suitability, and generate excellent data. Size exclusion is a non-adsorptive separation, so there's no chemistry involved. So why does it need extensive optimization? If you have a well-established platform method and well-behaved samples, the amount of optimization required may be minimal. However, this isn't always going to be true if the method, for example, needs to be transferred. It's commonly observed when transferring methods to see shifts in baseline, which causes issues in the integration of these aggregate or fragment peaks. What was once a good fragment separation can become terrible quite quickly, and suddenly your CDMO or partners complaining that their columns or methods are failing after one sequence, and this can make sustainability a challenge. What's needed to develop a robust and transferable size exclusion method is something that can survive tech transfer with minimal hands-on support. Before we go into the chromatography, I just wanted to recap the process of protein aggregation. So antibodies, like all proteins, are in equilibrium between their native and partially folded state. The protein in its stable or folded state when Gibbs free energy is minimized. So that means that the proteins want to be in their folded native form, and this is at the minimal energy point. But it doesn't take much to shift the protein into one of the other equilibrium forms, so to go from folded to unfolded, for example. And external factors like changes in pH, temperature, mechanical stress can lead to this unfolding or partial unfolding of the protein. In some instances, this can lead to oligomerization. This oligomerization can be reversible, and you can end up back with your antibody in the native state. But in the worst case scenario, this can become irreversible and leads to aggregate growth. Now, aggregates have the potential to impact safety and efficacy of a biotherapeutic and are a critical quality attribute. This means that they will need to be reported for any therapeutic. To understand the role of potential secondary interactions, I wanted to talk about the material science and surface chemistry of size exclusion columns. These columns are primarily fully porous silica, and size exclusion is a non-adsorptive separation. Now, because silica particles are inherently acidic, they're bonded with a diol stationary phase to minimize electrostatic interactions with any basic regions that you'll get on your protein. An important but often overlooked point with size exclusion is that it separates proteins based on hydrodynamic radius or volume and not by molecular mass or molecular weight. Now, there is a strong correlation between molecular weight and hydrodynamic radius, but because proteins have that tertiary and quaternary structure, and these can vary depending on the type of a protein, the behaviour by size exclusion isn't fully representative of the molecular weight. To briefly review the mechanism of size exclusion, analytes are either included or excluded from the pores, and this determines their elution order. So looking at the example that we have here, thyroglobulin, which has a hydrodynamic radius of 86 angstroms, will elute earlier than an IgG, which has a hydrodynamic radius of 51 angstroms. And this is because the thyroglobulin will be excluded from the smaller pores, so it exhibits an earlier retention time. It has a larger hydrodynamic radius, so less of these pores are available to it. Smaller analytes ingress and egress into and out of more of the pores and to a greater extent than those larger analytes, which is what results in this later elution time for size exclusion. Hydrodynamic radius is important to understanding the behaviour of an analyte by size exclusion. Even more critical, however, is that pore size and pore size distribution also will impact the separation. Pore size is critical to column performance. Today we're going to look at our new size exclusion column, the Biozen DSEC2, which is a 1.8 and a 3 micron particle platform, and it features the pore control technology. Again, pore size and distribution are what are most important when we're looking at performance for size exclusion. And what differentiates the Biozen DSEC3 is that, with regards to the pore volume, is that it has this remarkably small pore volume at 1 ml per gram. Now, other size exclusion columns typically exceed 1.2 ml per gram, and common ranges are between 1.4 and 1.6. Now, without context, this doesn't seem like too significant of a difference, but when we look at a comparison of the DSEC2 with traditional size exclusion columns, it helps really to demonstrate the difference that this smaller pore volume has. Here we're looking at the calibration curves that we've generated using standards with known hydrodynamic radii values plotted against elution volume. And using these curves, we can extrapolate unknown hydrodynamic radii values and also determine the exclusion size range that is appropriate for a given analytical size exclusion column. Here, the most apparent difference between these curves is the shift to the left observed with the DSEC2, especially with hydrodynamic radius values below 1.6 when plotted on this logarithmic scale. And this is due to the uniquely small 1 ml per gram pore volume for DSEC2 versus 1.4 to 1.6 ml more traditional silicas that we might use for a similar application. And what we're looking at here is the DSEC2 plotted on the blue curve versus a similar pore size column, but with a higher pore volume than the DSEC2 plotted in the yellow. Chromatographically, this is observed as a significant decrease in the elution volume, primarily of these smaller protein standards. So why do we believe that it's important to shift to this smaller pore volume? What are going to be the benefits to looking at this smaller pore volume? So to understand why we've deviated from the standard practice of high pore volume silica, it's first important to understand one of the major challenges with the silica that's used for size exclusion columns. Now, although size exclusion is a mature technique, it's plagued with many issues over the years. So if you've run a size exclusion column, you'll likely have experienced protein adsorption, out-of-the-box failures, and then unexpected and premature column death. And the root cause of these issues can be traced to the systemic use of relatively weak particles. Size exclusion particles have always historically been over-porous with these larger pore volumes compared to reverse phase silicas, which are around 0.6 to 0.8 mils per gram. So we are essentially sacrificing mechanical strength to prioritize a wider exclusion or separation range. But this high exclusion range is really only useful for working with unknown proteins. Modern size exclusion methods are developed for well-defined proteins. There are much tighter exclusion ranges when you want to look at something specific, so monomer or aggregate separation for monoclonal antibodies, for example. And so a lot of the unnecessary pore volume that we've had previously with size exclusion columns simply just leads to poor mechanical strength silica. And this poor mechanical strength silica prevents us packing the column at high enough packing pressures. When a column isn't packed at these higher packing pressures, it becomes susceptible to this premature column failure. Now, even sub 2 micron UHPLC size exclusion columns are a challenge to pack above 10,000 psi. And consequently, what happens is you end up with a loosely packed bed and low packing density. So a loosely packed size exclusion column will work great initially until the rigors of routine use begin to set in, or the column begins to get fouled. You can also see problems when a column stored in methanol and the flow rate isn't adjusted to accommodate for the viscosity of methanol. When you add methanol to your mobile phase, you'll see an increase in viscosity, and without offsetting the flow rate to bring the back pressure down, you're going to run the risk of premature column failure. Regardless of the reason, the result is a column void, which is a huge cavity at the head of the column bed, which results in a blob on your chromatogram, which is what we see at the bottom here. And you can't restore the column once this has happened. You have to replace it. And worst of all, some of the columns are packed better than others. And this is why you can see this column to column difference depending on how mechanically strong the individual column is. To assess packed bed stability, we ran a complex sequence, which is highlighted in this table here, the grid on the right, where flow rate is modulated and a method shutdown is included. So even at 0.45 mil a minute, which is a relatively fast flow rate for a 4.6 millimeter ID size exclusion column, the back pressures never exceed operating limits for the particle. However, this particular test isn't just about back pressure, it's about the changes in back pressure that can shuffle this packed bed and lead to column voiding. And this is especially true during startup and shutdown in size exclusion. And we benchmarked the DSEC2 against an industry standard hybrid 1.7 micron fully porous silica particle. And this particular particle has a 1.2 mil per gram pore volume, which is one of the smallest pore volumes on the market. So not surprisingly, this 1.7 micron hybrid silica is extremely stable over the 100 hours, and it only drops around 24% in column efficiency. Our particular criteria for a stable packed bed is a loss of no more than 25% drop in efficiency. That said, the constant bed stress did result in some erratic behaviour, and we can see this with some plates dropping significantly and then rebounding close to baseline. What we haven't shown here, but was measured as well, is that other silica-based size exclusion columns typically fail at around 20 to 30 hours. So this is a good example of packed bed stability. Our DSEC2 column, with its low 1 ml per gram pore volume, holds steady throughout the 100 hours, and the DSEC2 is run in comparison in green in the bottom trace. Through the 100 hours, there's no sign of plate count dropping, and this ruggedness can be attributed to the increased packing density permitted by the low pore volume silica. Now, one question that may come out from looking at this is, if we're losing pore volume, what's the impact in separation, and are we losing separation at least for monoclonal antibodies and other related formats for this particular type of work? And what we can see here is that we are not losing much at all. Aggregate analysis is principally focused on a relatively tight pore volume range. Dimer, monomer and monoclonal antibody fragment typically all fall between the hydrodynamic radius of 1.4 and 1.9 on this logarithmic scale, which is around 25 to 80 angstroms. And by overlaying the hydrodynamic radii of the analytes of interest with the calibration curve, we can see that they only occupy a small proportion of the curve. Fragments extend beyond that, but even then the linearity of the curve doesn't suffer too much. You can see here, even with this decrease in pore volume. And indeed, pores outside of the 120 to 250 angstrom window are not necessarily that critical for this particular type of separation. Now, if you're looking for a size exclusion column, for example, for insulin, this column is likely not going to address that because it's lost too many of those smaller pores. If you're looking for something with a large hydrodynamic volume, perhaps exceeding 20 nanometers for something like AAVs, you're not going to get the results that you need with this type of column for these sorts of separations either. But for a column that's optimal for dimer and fragment separation for monoclonal antibodies and other related modalities, the DSEC2 is really going to be the column to address this type of separation. So in summary, the pore volume has traditionally been prioritised, but at the expense of mechanical strength. Consequently, size exclusion method robustness has suffered, and as such, having a lower pore volume silica will enable a more robust and reliable separation for these particular modalities. In addition to mechanical strength, another crucial element for a size exclusion particle is the stationary phases used for bonding. And even the silica itself, especially a hybrid-based particle, may impact the overall hydrophobicity index of the particle. Additionally, every column vendor varies slightly in the diol used, whether in bonding density or the actual silane used for bonding. Even subtle changes in % carbon load can lead to increases in hydrophobicity. One of the mechanisms for aggregation is partial exposure of hydrophobic pockets of the protein. An overly hydrophobic surface may be problematic in size exclusion methods when you're looking at aggregation itself. And this is especially true with methods like the USP, which uses high levels of phosphate in the mobile phase. Phosphate does ensure protein stability. However, the partial salting out caused by the phosphate may pose some issues with an overly hydrophobic particle. Conversely, a hydrophilic particle requires quite a bit of salt to minimize electrostatic interactions. However, a hydrophilic particle is almost always preferred, as many methods require a high amount of phosphate for protein stabilization. Either way, the inertness of the particle for the DSEC2 column was prioritized in the development of this particular chemistry. One way to measure protein inertness is by measuring the protein recovery after injections of a protein standard. And here we're showing the overlay of a 4.2 microgram injection onto a freshly packed DSEC2 column. Essentially, from first injection to the last injection, we see negligible absorption of the proteins. Now, 4.2 micrograms isn't an appropriate mass load if we're looking at priming a column, and other proteins may behave differently, but using the guidance of these three different proteins, at least from a surface chemistry and particle development standpoint, we're confident that most proteins should recover most peak areas, allowing you to be confident in that out-of-the-box performance. So moving on from the introduction of the surface chemistry and the particle, and looking at how this might affect and benefit laboratories looking at method transferability. So when developing a size exclusion method, there are a few key system considerations to keep in mind. Size exclusion doesn't require high back pressure for separation. It's non-adsorptive and isocratic, and therefore any extra system volume in the form of system dwell volume, plumbing, flow cell, etc. will contribute to band broadening. Now, with size exclusion, traditionally a larger column, 7.8 millimeter ID, for example, has been preferred, as larger IDs can withstand that extra system volume more than these smaller column IDs. So if we just look at back pressure, it's always important to remember that in HPLC and UHPLC, back pressure is a symptom of optimal linear velocity or flow rate. It's not a requirement for separation. In fact, since size exclusion is non-absorptive, no partitioning separation occurs, so the lower flow rates can provide better separation. So as such, running a sub 2 micron DSEC2 column, 15 centimeter length, generates a relatively low back pressure, as we can see here when it's run on the Waters UPLC H-class bio. 30 centimeter only generates 331 bar at 0.35 milliminute. And interestingly, a sub 2 micron particle run at optimal flow rate still gives less than the 400 bar that technically would define it as being compatible with a standard HPLC instrument. So if we take that sub 2 micron 30 centimeter column from the previous example and run it on a non-UHPLC system, here we've got the Waters H-class down to an Agilent 1100. Now the 1100 does have an optimized flow path, so we have the microflow cell and the red peak tubing. It performs very well. Peak shape and overall chromatographic performance is acceptable, although resolution does suffer a little, and this is mainly due to the visually poorer peak shape of the monomer. If we look at the aggregate percentage, you'll see it's still fairly similar. what this tells us is that a UHPLC size exclusion column can be run on a traditional system, provided you make a couple of small system adjustments. Now, performance will not be quite as good as with a UHPLC because size exclusion is prone to system dwell volume, and even with those adjustments to flow cell and tubing, a standard HPLC system may simply still have too much system dwell volume. So the difference in performance between a sub 2 micron and a standard particle format may not be significant enough to switch to the 1.8 micron if you're working with something like this Agilent 1100 type system. That said, it is still possible to run these columns on these types of instruments. So if you want a column to perform across all platforms, it may be more prudent to run a 3 micron column. In terms of method transfer, especially to labs with known HPLC limitations, a column using a 7.8 micron and a 3 micron particle is often preferred because it's more resistant to those differences in dwell volume. If we just consider the differences between UHPLC systems, and now we have a bioinert system and a standard UHPLC system, and we're comparing an I-class to the H-class bio. So the former has significantly lower system dwell volume, so you might think that this will perform better. However, we can't achieve proper assessment of the performance as the standard stainless steel system shows a significant increase in baseline, and invariably this is due to the use of a non-titanium flow cell. So we see this much higher baseline with the standard UHPLC compared to this H-class bioinert system. So looking at column considerations with a focus on column dimensions and particle configurations. So first, longer columns are always going to provide an advantage for size exclusion, but this should be scaled for a specific application. As with an isocratic non-absorptive separation, longer columns are always going to lead to a longer method. Now, a longer column and a smaller particle will improve separation. However, given the smaller particle's potential for clogging, method robustness, as well as method transferability, this may present some challenges. So it may be, if you're looking at a longer column, that the sub 2 micron particle isn't a practical consideration. An often overlooked aspect of size exclusion is column ID. Now, we previously mentioned larger IDs are more resistant to system dwell or extra column volume. So if you want to run a 3 micron column, presumably because there's a concern around sample clogging, you might want to think about the specific column ID you're selecting. If you were to choose the 4.6mm ID, even using a relatively low system dwell volume, there is still a considerable drop in performance compared to a 7.8mm ID. The 400 microliter system dwell volume is around 2.7% of the total column volume of a 300 by 7.8, but for a 4.6mm ID column of the same length, it's around 8%. So if you anticipate a method is going to be run on multiple LC configurations because it has the potential to be transferred across different sites, then the 300 by 7.8 is likely going to be the better choice in these situations. Staying with column dimension, this time looking at column length, and we mentioned in the introduction slide that with size exclusion, a longer column will always afford higher efficiency and greater separation. And here we're looking at cetuximab, which is a good example as fragment 1 and fragment 2 clearly separate in a well-optimized method. Now, if we run the 150 by 4.6, we can see that the fragment 1 comes out as a post-peak, and this can lead to differences in reported percentage area compared to the longer columns. The downside to the longer column is that it'll double the method runtime. So here we can see a doubling of time from 6 to 12 minutes. So if separation, especially for fragments, is prioritised, then longer columns are necessary. If throughput's the concern, then the shorter column may be more than respectable, and aggregate percentages are likely to be relatively similar with both methods. So here we're comparing a shorter high throughput dimension, the 1.8 micron 150 by 4.6, with a traditional 300 by 7.83 micron column. And we have NISMAB, which has substantial amount of aggregate in the sample. There's also a well-defined fragment peak, making it a suitable candidate for method development. And we can see quite a difference in resolution with the RS exceeding 2 for the monomer and dimer using the standard 300 by 7.8 ID format. And this is ideal for any aggregate analysis method where resolution of monomer and dimer greater than 2 is needed. If you've worked with NISMAB and looked at optimizing the method before, there's still quite a lot more we could do with either one of these chromatograms, but I think this serves a nice summary of the differences that you can expect from these two very different dimensions and particle size columns. When it comes to the ideal column format to get optimized characterization of a monoclonal antibody separation, the best choice is going to be the 300 millimeter length packed with a sub 2 micron particle. Here again we have NISMAB with excellent separation of monomer and dimer, and fragments 1 and 2 are also separated out nicely. Fragment 1 isn't quite to baseline, but it still auto-integrates pretty well and is probably enough for what you're going to need in this method. So if fragment separation is prioritised and method throughput is not a concern, then the 300 by 4.6 UHPLC column format is going to be the preferred column dimension. The only caveat being that the sub 2 micron column will demand very good sample and mobile phase filtration to prevent clogging, as well as low system dwell volumes, so that you don't see that loss of efficiency from the narrower column ID. So moving on to optimizing legacy methods and some of the things that you might need to look at there. So if we look at updating a method from a legacy platform, many methods were built out using the standard 5 micron 300 by 7.8 format column, and there's a good reason that this was used. So the original silica-based particles and chemistries were the most hydrophilic, and that allowed for relatively high amounts of phosphate and co-solvent to be run without any fear of adsorption to the stationary phase. So when you're updating methods, especially comparing something like the DSEC2 column with the lower pore volume, you're going to need to consider there is going to be a shift in the solution window, and we can see that here. So what you'll see effectively is all analytes are going to elute earlier because you have a reduction in the total pore volume. And while this is essentially inconsequential for monoclonal antibodies formats, it is important to point out because it shows the effect it can have if you're working with a wider range of different protein types. Moving on to look at sub 2 micron particles, and here we have a comparison of different sub 2 micron particles going from the very recently launched DSEC2 right back to some of the very first UHPLC size-exclusion particles that were launched almost 10 years ago. And firstly, a discussion just on back pressure and particle platforms. We have this back pressure trace at the top of the slide here. And we mentioned previously, not all sub 2 micron particles are created the same. The particle size and even the distribution may be different. So the 2 micron 250 angstrom particle shown here in green, unsurprisingly at 0.35 ml/minute gives the lowest back pressure of around 300 bar. The DSEC2 particle runs at around 330 bar, while a 1.7 micron hybrid around 400 bar, with the 1.9 micron strangely actually running at the highest back pressure, exceeding 400 bar. Now, if we look at the chromatography, they all return similar high molecular weight species, with only the DSEC2 and vendor 1 giving fragment separation for trastuzumab here. If we compare a legacy 5 micron platform to an updated 3 micron DSEC2, and interestingly both elution times are approximately 6.8 minutes, which really highlights how pore volume is impacted only by removing the pore sizes, which don't contribute to the separation. If we compare the 3 micron to the 5 micron, there is an obvious gain in resolution as well as fragment separation, but the peak areas are essentially identical, highlighting the similar hydrophilic characteristics of the silica. What this does show us, though, is a reminder of exactly what gets improved when you go to smaller particle sizes. These smaller particle sizes are more efficient, as we can see in the improvement of the dimer from the monomer. However, when you transition to a new size exclusion platform, the intent is to move towards a more reliable solution and not necessarily one that's providing additional information. If you've got historical data only suggesting there is one fragment and you now see data with 2 different post-peak fragments, this is going to be a cause for concern. Here's an even more stark comparison looking at cetuximab once again, which should be quite familiar to many people. And this is actually a slightly lower mass load of 20 micrograms, which may be too low for this particular column dimension. Consequently, we see the benefit of higher efficiency improving the recovery of the high molecular weight species. Otherwise, we see the same theme here, the post-peak fragment profile changes when we're working with the 3 micron versus the 5 micron column here. Finally, just comparing the 1.9 micron particle, and there is a slight improvement in fragment separation here with the DSEC2 column. What is interesting actually with this 1.9 micron particle is, and you may have observed this with the back pressure traces, is that the retention time is significantly earlier compared to many of the other sub 2 micron size exclusion silicas, and the efficiency is actually quite high. And it's thought that this is an impressively monodispersed particle, and it's potentially this monodispersity that actually leads to those differences in retention time and back pressure. So going to a section on robustness, and this is one of the major frustrations with existing size exclusion columns. So beyond lot-to-lot assessment, there are several other considerations when tackling method robustness. One of the first being flow rate. Optimizing flow rate requires balancing back pressure, robustness, and throughput needs. Mobile phase composition is another critical component to robustness, given the impact that mobile phase has on protein interactions with the stationary phase. There is extensive experimental design that can be implemented here. Additionally, mass load and its impact to peak shape should be explored to determine the allowable range of sample concentrations. And lastly, we should also look at temperature. In general, lower flow rates improve chromatography. Increases in flow rate don't impact the separation. It's a matter of prioritizing throughput versus robustness. Higher flow rates put more strain on the column, and as a result, you potentially may see shorter column lifetime. So if we look at the effect of mobile phase composition and how that might impact the separation, This is actually a great way to indirectly determine how active your analyte might be on the stationary phase. So we mentioned previously that NISMAB is hydrophobic with a high isoelectric point, so it has a propensity for secondary interactions with a less than ideal method. So you can run different columns from different batches, and certainly another proper assessment might be to look at different mobile phase formulations, so potentially different phosphate concentrations, pH, and even co-solvent to determine the impact of your separation under different conditions. So the experimental design here was to take the standard USP formulation of 200 millimolar potassium phosphate, 250 millimolar potassium chloride at pH 6.2 and modify each component. And the first example modulates ionic strength of the mobile phase with potassium chloride. And even from 100 to 250 millimolar, a nominal difference is observed, with peak areas being relatively similar even with low concentrations of potassium chloride. A similar effect is observed with the phosphate, so 50 millimolar, which is relatively low and not quite as protein stabilizing, will certainly minimize hydrophobic absorption, but it returns identical results compared to the 200 millimolar. Notably the percentage purity of the monomer. So this is not affected even at these lower phosphate concentrations. Adjusting pH can induce notable changes, especially as the pH approaches the pI of the protein. And at pH 7.2, the post-peak fragment indeed does lose separation a little here. And that's due to partial peak broadening observed within the monomer. Retention times are relatively similar here, which indicates a minimum hydrophobic retention for this particular protein. So if we look at total mass load on the column, and we've really sort of skipped over what that might be, but it's not actually a trivial thing when we look at mass load. And sometimes you need to load an excess of sample to get a proper assessment of your aggregate peak, especially if the amount of aggregate is below 0.2% by peak area. So here we've got NISMAB again, and now we're looking at 30 versus 100 micrograms on column and comparing chromatographic performance. So aside from a slight shift in retention time here, the percentage monomer is essentially identical, while the resolution of the monomer and the high molecular weight species is similar as well. So there's no adverse effects to the mass load in this particular application. In the previous chromatogram, we looked at two loadings, a lower level and the 100 micrograms, the slightly higher level, and we saw very similar results. But when you load extremely concentrated samples onto a column, you can begin to lose peak shape. And it's possible for samples loaded above 20 mg per mil to show this instability that arises due to the more viscous sample that displaces the mobile phase, and the result that you get from this is this unusual or poor peak shape. Practically speaking, for highly concentrated samples, a simple dilution can eliminate the issues, and that's why sample concentration is a critical aspect to your method robustness. So the recommended experimental design for this type of thing would be to inject different concentrations of protein. And in this instance, we did serial dilutions from 25 mg per mil to 3.0 125 mg per mil and simply increase the injection volume to ensure 100 micrograms was injected onto the column at all times. And the overlay shows no differences in chromatographic performance. And this may seem inconsequential, but understanding the impact that injection volume and precision have, as well as the differences in concentration, all contribute to the robustness within your method, because all these things can contribute to the variability. When it comes to platform methods, the standard USP mobile phase is a good starting point. We went over this before. It's 200 millimolar phosphate, which is quite a lot, but with a hydrophilic phase, it shouldn't be too much of an issue. 250 millimolar potassium chloride is more than sufficient to minimize ionic interactions, especially as if you're working with more basic proteins when running a pH 6.2. So here we see good performance for a wide variety of different monoclonal antibodies, including different isotypes, Fc fusions, and a bispecific seen here, which has a very small amount of aggregate present. So finally, just looking at batch to batch and column to column performance. And the most obvious way to assess method robustness is simply evaluating different batches, 3 at minimum, but 6 may be necessary depending on your resources. So intra-batch or within the same batch should also be looked at, just to ensure that there isn't a robustness issue within the method there. Now, regarding what parameters to look at, relative peak areas and resolution are most critical, and probably should be some of the ones that are included in this study. And recommendations for system suitability should also really be decided at this point. So defining what the gold standard for your protein mix is, to allow you to really ascertain that you have that. So here we're looking at 6 different batches of the 1.8 micron DSEC2, and the chromatogram stack shows very good performance for NISMAB across all 6 batches. The 3 primary metrics looked at were high molecular weight species by peak area percentage, monomer percent area, and resolution. So all percentage CV values are below 4%. Monomer percent area is fantastic, with any other percent high molecular weight species, aggregate, and resolution likely varying due to sample or integration differences, but again still falling well within that acceptable range. Looking at intra-batch, so columns within the same batch to see what variation is like, and indeed results for the 3 aforementioned chromatographic parameters are still below 3% in CV. Variation actually looks very similar to the intra-batch variation. So what this really tells us is that the variation to be expected in size-exclusion columns may be a little more than we've seen in other techniques, but all offer extremely high robustness for this particular type of methodology. So in summary, size-exclusion is a primary analytical method for quantitation and characterization of protein aggregates and fragments. The new DSEC2 with low pore volume silica gives a robust particle that enhances column life without compromise to chromatographic performance. To ensure the highest quality data when transferring methods, instrumentation needs to be considered and care needs to be taken when selecting column dimensions and surface chemistry. And a thorough method robustness evaluation should include parameters such as mobile phase composition, flow rate, injection volume, and inter and intra-batch column variation.